Hi everybody, I am so sorry for the back and forth I've done with the lives here. We're going live with Sandeep. I was trying to find their Instagram possibilities, the Circle India's work, Teach for India, and all things that education and policy and autism and all of that. So give me a second till we have them. I'm super excited. Sandeep is just excellent at. Give me a second. I'm sorry. Sandeep isn't able to join. All right, here he is. Yay, finally.
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, Sandeep.
Hi.
I am so sorry about the account. I just couldn't find the Circle India's account. So this is great. Thank you for using yours.
That's okay.
Uh, okay,
You can talk.
amazing. I am so. Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
Okay. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I can hear you and I can see you. This is fabulous. So I'll just take a minute to talk about what this will be about and then we'll get right into it.
Perfect.
Awesome. So Sandeep and I work together at Teach for India. We've both been educators in the space of education and autism, and inclusion and, working towards good stuff in the space of education for the last more like decade and a half. Sandeep is incredible at everything he does, and that's why this is so, so, so special for me personally and also so important for Brain Bristle. So I am so excited to just have him talk and share all he knows about India, the Indian inclusive landscape, special education policies, and his own journey from TFA to TFI to now running the Circle India. So thank you, Sandeep, for doing this. I am forever always grateful to you. So,
Very
Sandeep,
kind.
let's
It's good to
just
be here.
yeah, it's amazing. So let's just start with like talking about your journey, what got you into education to begin with, the TFA fellowship, then TFI, and now the circle. And while you're at it, talk a little bit about the circle also. It'll be amazing.
Yeah, of course. Very kind of you. So thank you for all of that. It's good to be here. I'm very excited about all of the work that you're doing as well, Devangana. Um, my journey started about 18 years ago. And I actually did not think I would be going into education and thought I would go into medicine and had a very big change of heart at the last minute, had a bit of an epiphany, and that's that I was going into medicine for all of the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And so at the last minute, I actually asked myself, like, if I wake up one day and I really want to basically ask myself, how are you changing the way the world works? Like, what's the best thing I can be impacting? And for me, the answer to that was poverty.
Right.
And then I asked myself again, like, if I really want to be able to impact poverty, what is the single biggest key lever I could be pulling? And for me, the answer was education. And so I decided to teach, and I joined Teach for America. I taught in Washington D.C., taught in a quintessential American government school in urban America, which basically meant that the school, had been failing kids academically for many, many years, but it also was just a very unsafe school for kids.
Yeah.
That school fundamentally shifted the person that I became. It just transformed me. It taught me a lot. Like, it taught me that schools have the power to be catastrophic. They also have the power to be transformational. Um, and that usually the differentiator between those two extremes are people. They're the people leading schools or the people teaching in schools. Everything I've done since then has been trying to chase those two solutions. I moved to India in 2008 to try to help get Teach for India off the ground. Thought I would be here for a year, and that was 16 years ago. Spent about 14 years with Teach for India, trying to help build that, overseeing a lot of our teacher prep, also overseeing a lot of our operations and strategy across our regions. And then shortly after that, I founded the Circle, which was about a little under 3 years ago. Pivoted out of Teach for India to be able to do this, and I think the Circle was born, out of a deep belief that schools just hold power. Schools hold an enormous amount of power. They are the primary delivery mechanism through which, we try to basically give kids an education. And yet when you look at them, like, we also have to recognize that they're going obsolete. Like, they are not serving kids for an India that exists today. They're serving kids for an India that existed some 75 years ago. And so what we lean into at the Circle is, if we really want kids to succeed, then we have to figure out how to make sure that the unit of a school succeeds.
Right.
And that means we need to basically ask ourselves, like, how do we get schools to be able to come into the modern age? Which
Yeah.
means we need to be asking ourselves, how do we reinvent school?
Right.
And so everything we do at the Circle is on this mission to reinvent school specifically so that it works fundamentally better
Yeah.
for kids from low-income communities. Yeah, let me pause there.
That's amazing. A lot of the high schoolers that I've worked with, taught in Hong Kong, are on this live, and I'm glad they're listening to the cool stuff that the Circle's doing. It's always inspiring. So Sandeep, talk a little bit about, first in your work at building, while at building uh, TFI, then work building Circle India. And like, you've also been, a teacher in Washington, D.C. through the Teach for America Fellowship. What's your understanding of the inclusive education and special education landscape? Where do you think that is? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think my understanding of this started first and foremost as a teacher, and unfortunately, most of my learnings have been around all that doesn't
Yeah.
work. More of my learnings have been around what doesn't work than what,
Right.
what does, and
Right.
and that's just because of, how far we have to go, and I
Yeah.
think it started as a teacher with seeing so many of my kids struggle, and seeing so many of my kids have needs that just could not be met through a traditional
Yeah.
classroom, through the classroom set up in the way that we know it today.
Yeah.
Um, it was, learning about it by watching, kids that basically, were on different parts of the spectrum and had, neurodivergent needs, but were basically, sequestered off into separate rooms, and just seeing how incredibly unjust that was, but also just how incredibly just wrong that was,
Yeah.
and not conducive for their needs. Um, it's continued in India, right?
Right.
And like, we in India, we spent so much of the last 35, 40 years. First, we spent time trying to get kids into
Yeah.
school, right? And that was the big push for decades, right?
Right.
And around the early 2000s, we finally started to hit rates of access that were really high. And then became the question around the mid 2000s, which is, well, what do you do with kids when they're in school? And how do we make sure that they're getting an education that is high in quality? And unfortunately, in all of that, I think what's been left out is, well, are we actually like able to cater to all
And all.
kids? And the
Yeah.
honest answer is
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
And so I say that to say I can tell you, stories of hope, which I would love to be able to do, that are basically proving that wrong. But so much has been around, like, just how much is left to be done.
Yeah. And Sandeep, like, in my work, I mean, as you know, I've been in the space of autism and inclusion for now almost a decade and a half.
Yeah.
And what I understand is that a classroom comes with so many needs. It's a microcosm
Yeah.
of a million needs. And then you've got also got autism, and you've got, like, a child acting out. And it's a lot for the education system to cater to those needs single-handedly by one teacher who's trying to teach curriculum and meet goals and all of that. So it's really complex, and that's why so many kids who could thrive in an inclusive mainstream school get moved to a special school, because we just don't have the resources to do right by them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay. So Sandeep, I'm curious to hear your perspective on. I've been to a lot of schools where there are kids on the spectrum of autism in India, New York, and Hong Kong, who are there and not being supported, or who are being there and being supported. And there's just like a lot of mix up in the space. But if we suppose that curriculum infrastructure, trained resources in autism, learning disabilities, ADHD, or the lack of any of this even needed. It's just the belief that, you know, one main homeroom teacher can solve all the problems of a classroom. Is the deterrent in schools actually being truly inclusive and doing right by kids on the spectrum? Um, how do you think Indian schools, especially the low income schools, because that's where the mass of our population is, could better be adapted to the needs of kids who are desperately in need, and we don't want them to drop out of the mainstream school system? So, how do we better adapt our schools to do right by them?
Yeah. So first of all, I think we need to start to shift our lens on all of this, right? And we need to start to see it as this enormous opportunity. And that
Yeah,
opportunity is, we've got an opportunity to make sure that all kids are learning, you know, and that all kids are getting what they both need and deserve, as you just said. I think right now it's not seen as that as an opportunity, right? It's seen as
right,
like another burden or another responsibility. And as long
right,
as we continue to see it as that, like we're not actually going to be able to shift it in the ways that it needs to be shifted. But I think once we're able to shift our lens, then I think that there's, you know, several things that we both could and should be doing. And one of them is that, you know, we just need to figure out how to get early diagnosis in. We need to figure out how to basically make sure that we're able to understand the needs of kids very early so that we're able to get support.
yeah,
And then two is we just need to be equipping teachers with tools to be able to better cater, right? Some of that is, you know, how do you basically equip teachers with tools to better personalize learning, right? How do you equip teachers and, you know, instructors with tools to be able to better differentiate instruction, but also to differentiate assessments for kids?
right,
And then also, how do we start to use so much of the technology that's, you know, assistive technology and adaptive technology to be able to cater to kids in personalized ways? And I think there's so much that's emerging that just hasn't made its way into the classroom that could really just make this much easier
right,
for educators in low income contexts.
yeah.
Um, but I think so much of that starts with the lens shift. Because until we start to shift our lens on some of this, and we're just going to basically see it as another burden when actually it's far from that, you know?
Yeah. And do you think like it's a resource constraint that sometimes you're just like, you know, a low income school has so many other needs they'd rather fulfill than get like somebody assigned to take care of kids who are acting out and, you know, not performing, not meeting grade level needs or academic or social needs.
You know,
So yeah,
100%. No, I do think we have to acknowledge that there is a dearth of resources that
yeah,
is driving a lot of this.
yeah,
And I think if we can make that lens shift, then I just think how we approach that dearth of resources is going to be fundamentally different, right?
right, right,
Um, and so, yes, I do think part of it is a different, better resource allocation, but I also think part of it is just like we need to see the work as being fundamentally different than how we see it today.
right, right. I mean, in my work in India, I've seen there's like one counselor who comes once a week to a school to see some stuff, and yeah. Okay, so getting on to some good stuff. So can you share some stories, Sandeep, of success from the Circle India or like, you know, the TFI alumni who are in different spheres of inclusion, disabilities, autism, or any of that? Any success stories that you think just like are inspiring and should be heard?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple, and I think one is we have a new micro school coming up in Bangalore called Spots,
Yeah,
uh, which is run by an incredible, you know, entrepreneur who has spent about a decade of work, you know, at the cornerstone of inclusion, and they're doing a lot. They're trying to design this as a micro school that caters specifically to kids, you know, that are neurodivergent, and they're doing so much to be able to try to push this at the forefront, right? They're figuring out how do you actually like really deeply personalize learning for kids.
yeah,
They're trying to do things like vocational learning and makers labs and things that are basically usually available for, you know, many other kids, but not available for kids that are neurodivergent. And
yeah,
they're trying to get those into their hands, you know.
yeah,
And through all of that, they're just really redefining and reinventing, you know, what learning could be for kids, and feeling very hopeful about
right,
that. But they're not just doing that; they're also figuring out how do you actually get the support that
right,
kids need
right,
into their hands, you
right,
know, to be able to succeed and thrive. And so that's really exciting. I think in Pune, like when I worked there for many years, you worked very closely with the Anjali Morrison Foundation, which did so much to be able to basically provide early diagnosis for kids from low income communities. And I just think we
Yeah.
need more of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They did a lot to be able to democratize it, to be able to bring down cost.
Yeah.
I think in Bombay, there's the Java Keel, school, which is doing a lot to be able just to push the boundaries for what kids
Yeah.
need. We have there's Circle Entrepreneur that's doing something called Micro Leaps, and what they're trying to do is just figure out how to personalize learning for kids.
Yeah.
And again, I think the more that we start to adapt some of these strategies, the more we start to be able to provide it for more and more kids, and the more that inclusion starts to become a reality.
Yeah.
And then Sangana, there's your work, which I think has been
Yeah.
incredibly inspiring.
Right.
Um, and I know that, you're also trying to say, like, how do we actually push this in
Yeah.
to basically government schools? And I just think we just need more of these.
Yeah.
But I also think that we need more work for people that are not just doing it, but that are also trying to advocate, which is why I think the work of Brain Bristle is so powerful, because I know it's also at the intersection of how do you actually push research out, but how do you talk about it more so that we start to
Right.
change the
And I think,
conversation. How much
Sandeep,
we
our
think.
work is that, if you've got a classroom of 40 kids or a classroom of 30 kids and you've got two autistic kids, how do we just keep them there and don't like build new infrastructure, new stuff for them, but just keep them there and provide all the resources there
Precisely.
that we can? Like, just make a public school right by them rather than
Precisely.
telling them they don't belong here. Um,
Precisely.
and I think like that's been my work the last 15 years, which is just telling kids on the spectrum of autism, you belong right here in a mainstream school, and if we can't serve you, it's our problem and it's not your problem.
The,
So I think
the
that's
problem with that,
basically,
and the
huh?
problem with that is that right now for low income communities, like that feels like a radical
Mm.
solution, right?
Right.
And so the fact that you're actually pushing that, I think, is just incredible, because I think that's what has the power to change the conversation.
Right. 100%. Um, yeah, and I think parents sometimes don't even believe that their child can be in a mainstream school and can actually be there for 4 hours. They're just like maybe an hour, and like the rest of the day they spend
Yeah,
outside in therapies. And I'm just like, no, let's push the schools to do better by their children.
yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, so Sandeep, I know like you have a way better understanding of India's inclusive landscape, India's education sector, entrepreneurs, what's going on. Um, what do you think, like what policy reforms do you think are most urgent, or what can be done to improve the environment of, I mean, we just saw the big American election, and I'm so into politics. I love all this, but I'm just really curious about what policies do you think we need to actually make our educational system and infrastructure a lot stronger? Talk a little about the EDP. What impact did it have? Will it have? What do you see forthcoming in the future? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And let's start, I think, with what's in the NEP, and I think some of the policy reforms that it's called for. It's specifically called out, the need for early diagnosis, right? It's specifically called out the need for more inclusive schooling and the need to be able to stop labeling.
Yeah.
It's specifically called, for the need for better teacher training,
Yeah.
for teachers that to be able to basically think about inclusive education. It's called out the use of assistive technology, right?
Yeah.
It's also basically like recommended establishing resource centers in low income areas that actually are catering to kids, right? It's also basically, recommended the use of more vocational training for kids. So it's made a lot of pretty smart recommendations, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that we have to get this into implementation.
Yeah.
And I think like that's what's needed, right? Like we need to basically figure out how do you start to get this into implementation more.
Yeah.
Um, and then similarly, right? Like there was the National Allied and Healthcare Professions Act, right, which basically came out in 2021,
Yeah.
and that recognized more than 50 healthcare professions, right, including many that actually work with kids, on the spectrum, and that was a big move, right? And what it simultaneously called for was just better standardization, better accreditation, particularly basically for these professions. Which what that does is that raises the bar of practitioners actually working. That actually makes sure that we start to raise quality
Yeah.
of practitioners working within schools. And I think all of those are just so needed.
Yeah.
I just think we need to basically figure out how to start resourcing this,
Yeah.
you know, and how to basically start pushing all of this more and more into implementation. Because when you look at what's recommended at a policy level versus what's happening in many of our schools,
Yeah.
like they're very far apart.
So, Sandeep, can I ask you a question? This wasn't on our list, but can I ask you a question as almost like an entrepreneur seeking advice? But when I began the work of building Brain Bristle, I wasn't sure how do I prove the need for somebody to be there in a low income school, like, an ex school in Bandra East, which has 40 kids and two kids on the spectrum of autism, just sitting there and doing, something. I didn't know how to prove the need to get funding, to actually get the wheel rolling, to actually create advocacy around it. Because it just wasn't happening. They were just like, this is something that's not happening, and we don't get it. Like, why do we need something? And to show impact, it would need me 1 year, 2 years to actually be in the system, doing the same thing, spending time with the same kids to show impact. What's your advice to a new entrepreneur, somebody who's new into getting into this space?
Yeah, I think it'd be a couple of things. I think one is we need to start to make an argument of what this means at a national
Yeah,
stage.
yeah,
We need to start to make an argument for a percentage of kids that we think are actually that are diagnosed, and the percentage of the numbers of kids at a national macro level as a proportion of the 1.3 billion citizens that we have. We need to basically turn that into both a moral and an economic argument.
yeah,
And I think people need to hear that moral and economic argument, because I think what your average person hears is we have a population that's so large, like why focus. And I think we need to turn that into both a moral and an economic argument for the future of India. And then I think second is we just need to get more examples of what's working.
yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
think once we can start to basically get more and more examples of what's working, we're able to say, hey, like there is this moral and economic imperative. And we've also got examples that are really basically showing that this is possible. Like think of what would basically be true if we were to flip this with all of India's schools.
yeah,
Um, and I don't want to basically, say that that's an easy argument to make in today's India, but I do think it's an argument that we have to keep
yeah.
making.
Yeah. No, I mean, I fully hear you. And I think it's just like, as an entrepreneur, you just have to stay at it until you're able to show the impact. And sometimes that just takes a lot of resilience and hard work and exhaustion and keeping your team motivated that we're on it. We're going to get there. We're going to make, show our impact soon enough. Um, what's been your journey like just a bigger question, because I think there's so many entrepreneurs who are going to be listening to this. What's been your journey building the circle? What learnings did you bring from your time at TFI into what you started with the circle? How is building TFI less or more difficult than building the circle? Just like thoughts on building movements, building organizations in the
Yeah.
nonprofit.
No, I mean, it's been a pretty incredible journey thus far. It's been a roller coaster across the past 16 years of doing this
Yeah,
work.
yeah,
Um, I think it's been, I think the past few years and, to go more recent, I think have been, um, taught me a lot about, I think we've been getting into a lot of small
yeah,
towns. And I think, half of our work is actually in, tier 3, tier 4 cities across India. And that's been eye opening.
yeah.
Um, and it's also pushed my sense of possibility, because we've discovered, so much that like there's just so much hunger and so much need, but also success is just so possible. And I think that's pushed me a lot, because before the last 3 years, I was mostly working in urban India. And so that's been something that's pushed me quite a lot. I think it's taught me a lot about like, what it means to be able to support entrepreneurs, and, you know, a lot about the landscape of how do you actually get schools set up. Like that journey, I think, has been one has been quite incredible, and it's been a roller coaster.
Yeah,
uh, yeah, so I
yeah.
think a ton of learnings across both of those
No,
organizations.
that's amazing. And tell me, like, so after your 2 years that you run the incubation for an entrepreneur, do you like still support them? Has your first batch graduated? Like, has it has, right? Like your first set of entrepreneurs. Do you like still oversee their work? How does that work?
Yeah, so the way the Circles Network works is that we look for social entrepreneurs who want to start new schools,
Hmm.
or for people who want to start new after school programs.
Mm.
And then we basically incubate them for 18 months. And during those 18 months, we teach them how do you design new schools, how do you design new programs, like how do you get them off the ground. And then we work with them to actually teach them how do you run them really, really well.
Yeah.
And that whole spectrum includes like how do I think about curriculum and pedagogy, but also like how do I think about the layout of my space? How do I figure out my building and funding and budgeting to how do I train teachers? And so it's a very intensive 18 months.
Yeah.
That includes coaching every week to, workshops every month to we're visiting, maybe 4 or 5 dozen different schools over the course of 18 months. Like it's a lot of exposure combined with capacity building, combined with like deep on the ground thought partnership and coaching and support. Um, and through that time, we just try to wrap our hands around to say, you know what, like once we basically jump on board, like we're going to do everything we can to help you get this off the ground and to get it off the ground at high quality.
Yeah.
And then once you graduate from the incubation,
Mm.
you enter our network. And when you enter the Circles network, that means that you continue to be surrounded with support.
Yeah.
And that means, ongoing capacity building, ongoing support with being able to get access to funding, ongoing support, with site visits and thought partnership. And our intention is to basically continue to provide you with that support to be able to make sure that you're able to succeed over time. And so, yes, the support continues uh, much after the 2 years. When you're a part of the network, that means you basically get access to that support for the long term.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. And what have been some big struggles while building the two different movements you've been a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I can point to many.
Yeah.
I mean, I can talk about, finding people, I can talk
Yeah.
about like, how this has kept us on our toes because of,
I
working
hear.
with entrepreneurs. You basically are, you're switching and you're moving all the time. Um, but honestly, I think like the biggest, most prevalent like challenge of the last 18 years has just been the challenge that you encounter when you get really close to poverty,
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think that any challenge I could talk about would basically be even stack up in comparison to the challenges of actually just working and getting really close to communities that basically live that struggle every single
Yeah.
day. Um, and the challenges that come with that are, being many years behind where kids should be, having to deal with, not only basically getting an access to a poor education, but poor nutrition and all of the challenges that basically come when you live in poverty. And so I think when you get close to that, I think you start to understand that. And those
Yeah.
have probably been the biggest challenges that we continue to basically grapple with.
Yeah. No, I know. It's yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. So that was amazing, Sandeep. I hear a lot of what you're saying. I spend a lot of my morning supervising and visiting schools where we place social workers who work with kids on the spectrum, and it's just like, where do you begin solving problems? There's just so much. So yeah, no, it's outstanding the work you guys do. Anything else you'd want to share? I know we have to end soonish, but anything else you want to share while we're at it? Autism, inclusion, India. Where do we push the boundaries? Where do we go? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that I think we've got a lot of work to do, and yet I think I'm also just so hopeful.
Yeah.
I think that when you look at surveys from the last like 10 years of Indians and of consumers, I think you find that, Indians really care deeply about education. Like,
Yeah.
in fact, people will rate education as something that they would basically spend on more than anything else, actually. And that underlying that is this deep
Yeah.
belief education just holds transformative power.
Yeah.
And so I think like there's this deep belief in the power of education. There's also this reality that we just have the world's largest share of young people,
Yeah.
And when you combine both of those, I just think like so much is possible, And so I think more than anything, I feel incredibly hopeful about all that's ahead. Um, and I think that there's so much to be done, and yet like there's just so much that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you for this. I just feel you always bring like this ray of positivity, which on a Friday evening I definitely need. So thank you, Sandeep. This was amazing and super helpful because I've been at it with Brain Bristle, build inclusion, don't let autistic kids drop out of mainstream schools, keep them in. So any push from any, thought leaders like you guys that comes just really helps our work. And I hope this helps your work too. So thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Devanga, and
Thank you.
huge hats off and so much gratitude for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And for
Thank
Brain Bristle, yeah.
you
Excited
so
to
much.
see what comes next.
Thank you. See you. Take care. Bye, Sandeep. Thank you.